Hello everyone, this is Matt from Real World Review, and today we're going to change the back glass on the iPhone XS Max. So the tools you're going to need are going to be a P2 driver, a Y000 driver, a PH000 driver, a razor blade, a pick, a playing card, an Xacto knife like this, a standoff bit, and some heat. You'll also need some clamps, as well as some glue for that back. Also, you need some protective gear, like these glasses for your eyes, and a glove that can withstand a lot of heat, like this one. And in this case, the glass that we're going to use just goes over the camera lens like this. It doesn't go in between the camera lens, so make sure you're buying the correct one, and that'll be in the description below. So the first thing we're going to do is remove the bottom two screws. Then what we're going to do is lift up the screen using a razor blade and possibly some heat, but in this situation, I'm just going to use a razor blade and a pick. So I use a razor blade to lift up the screen and then a pick to cut through the adhesive. Remember to go through a thin line on the bottom, the right side, and the left side. You don't want to tear any cables or break the screen. Once you cut the sides, then you want to cut through the top on the left side and then get this little piece on the right side. The screen should lift up a very slight amount and then over to the right. If there's any adhesive attached to the screen, make sure to cut that before you lift up the screen. Then you'll put it over to the side like this. Next, you're going to grab the Y000 bit and remove these 3 screws right here, as well as a metal piece, and then you're going to use that bit to remove these 4 screws, as well as that metal piece. Then what we want to do is unplug the battery right here, and then unplug the digitizer cable, the LCD cable, and carefully remove and unplug this top flex cable. There is some adhesive right here, and if you tear it, you will ruin Face ID, so make sure not to tear any of those cables. Put that off to the side, and then we can start removing the logic board. So next we're going to remove the SIM card. And what we're going to do is we're going to move this little piece right here and make sure that it's lined up properly. So then when we remove the logic board, it makes it a little bit easier to take out. Then what we're going to do is grab the PH000 driver and remove these screws right here, as well as this little metal piece right here. Make sure you know where it goes. Then we're going to grab the standoff bit and remove this screw right here. Then what we're going to do is start unplugging these cables, getting ready to remove the logic board. And this bottom cable can be moved down. You can do it now or later, but right now is going to be convenient. And then what we want to do with this little metal piece right here is move it over to the side and kind of remove it from the phone. Should be fairly easy, but sometimes it can be difficult. Then we can try to unplug these 2 top cables right here. They can be a little bit difficult, but what we're going to do is we're going to lift up the logic board and unplug them once we lift it up. So we're going to lift it up like this, and then we're going to unplug the cables. It makes it a little bit easier to do. Make sure not to tear these cables, obviously, and make sure not to tear any other cables next to it. Once those are unplugged, the logic board should just come out and you can set it aside. Then the next thing we're going to do is remove all the charging port stuff. So we're going to grab the Y000 bit and remove all these screws down here. And then we can lift up this little metal piece and put it off to the side. And if you didn't know, always make sure you know exactly where these screws are going to go, because it does get confusing. Then we're going to remove this screw and remove this little speaker cover, which can be a little bit difficult because it is hooked in, but you can just take it out like that. Then we can unplug the speaker while we're at it and remove this standoff screw, this one as well. Then we can switch to the PH000 bit, remove this 1 screw right here, and then the speaker should kind of lift up from the top to the bottom. Then we can remove it. Don't really worry too much about the seal because this phone probably isn't water resistant in the first place. Then you can continue using that standoff bit and remove this screw right here and these 2 screws right here, as well as this other screw right here, and then we can remove this little plastic piece. Then we can grab the PH000 bit and remove these 3 screws, unplug the Taptic engine, and remove it. Now this cable is held in by a few different screws, so what we're going to do is grab the PH000 bit and remove those screws. And we're going to carefully try to remove the battery itself. There are some pull tabs for the battery, which may be easy to remove, and some may be difficult to remove. But either way, what you want to do is focus on removing those pull tabs without breaking anything. But if they do break, we're not going to worry too much about that, because what we're going to do is we're going to heat up the back to loosen up that adhesive. Because we are going to add a lot of heat to this phone, it doesn't really matter too much. But remember, there is a battery right here, so you don't want to add too much heat. Next, we're going to remove the bottom 2 screws that are holding the charging port in. And then we're going to have to try and loosen up this little area to remove the charging port. It may be a little bit difficult to do, but what we're going to try to do is loosen up the microphone area like this. And then what we're going to do is loosen up the charging port cable, and we're going to have to maneuver both of these cables so then you can get it out of the way and make sure not to tear it. If you feel a lot of resistance, feel free to add some heat, but you should be able to take it out without any heat. Once you get to the microphone area, you most likely are going to want to apply some heat. I am used to this, so I was able to remove it without doing that. But if you feel more comfortable with adding just a little bit of heat, feel free to do that. Then what we're going to do with this little antenna down here is I'm just going to lift up the left side, or in this case the right side, and I'm going to cut through the adhesive with that pick. And then it should just lift up like this. Next, what we're going to do is remove this little cover area, and we're going to start removing these screws here. So we're going to grab the PH000 bit and remove all these screws that you see here, and then we can start removing this little wireless charging antenna as well as the cables that attach to it. So you can just lift up these cables, but be very careful and make sure not to tear that. If you want to add a little bit of heat to this too, you can feel free to do that, but just focus more on not tearing that cable. Now the top piece may be a little bit difficult to remove, but if you add some heat and you be very careful, it can fall out like this. Now that this is loosened up, we can remove the rest of the wireless charging. We'll want to cut through this adhesive just a little bit so then we can get a pick under the wireless charging panel. Once we get a pick under the wireless charging panel, it should kind of come off like this after we cut through the adhesive. You want to make sure to get under the coil, or else you could damage it and make wireless charging very difficult to do or impossible. Next, we're going to remove the Face ID, which just requires us to lift up these cables. It's not really too big of a deal, but again, if you feel any resistance, add some heat. Then it should just come out like this. You might have to push down a little bit on the left side, but it should just fall out. Next, we want to remove all these screws, and again, like I said, make sure you keep everything in place as well as these little metal pieces that go on top of these areas. They all go in a certain way, so you have to make sure to know exactly how they go in. And it looks like all these screws are Phillips screws, so all you got to do is just use the PH000 bit, and then you can just carefully lift out this cable. Next, what we want to do is remove the camera area, so we're going to remove these two Phillips screws right here, lift up the camera cover and put it over to the side. Then we're going to lift up the camera like this, starting with the left side and pushing over to the right side. Be careful not to tear those cables. Then what we're going to do is lift up the camera flash very carefully because there is a microphone behind it. And we're going to lift up the microphone as well. Once both of those are released from the phone, this cable is very flimsy, so be very careful. But what we want to do is lift it up just a little bit so then we can tape it down to the phone. So what I'm going to do is get some Kapton tape, which has some heat resistance, and I'm going to put a piece under it, and I'm going to put a piece over the camera flash so then it doesn't melt. You can use any tape that's supposed to be heat resistant, but I like to use the Kapton tape. Then what we're going to do is carefully move all of our parts and get ready to remove the back. And in that process, we're going to add some glasses and the EV glove. Again, link is in the description below. So the first thing we're going to do is heat up the back, get like a base heat, if that makes sense. That way the whole back is just kind of warm. And then what we're going to do is focus on a certain area, mainly the area where it's really cracked, and use that razor blade to kind of lift up the pieces. It may not be the easiest thing to do, especially if it's not as cracked as you want it to be, but we can use that playing card to kind of cut through the adhesive on this phone. I don't know why it works, but sometimes it does work. But the main thing we want to do is lift up a decent amount of glass so then we can get the Xacto knife in here. So once we do get a decent amount of area, we're going to add some heat, maybe 5 to 10 seconds, staying on one area and then letting it cool for a little bit, and then adding some more heat if you need to. And then what we're going to do is use that Xacto knife to cut through the adhesive, and you can kind of feel when it gets difficult to do, because then that's when you need to add more heat. But pretty much what you want to do is use the Xacto knife for about 10 to 15 seconds and then add some more heat. And once you get to the edges and there's a bunch of small pieces, switch to the razor blade because using the Xacto knife can slip fairly easily and make it very difficult for that plastic trim to stay in one piece. But either way, keep repeating this and using that Xacto knife to remove the big pieces and a razor blade to remove the small pieces. But the main goal is to start either at the top or at the bottom and then work your way to the camera lens. You don't want to do the camera lens just yet. So let's get rid of all this glass and make sure everything looks nice. And now we're pretty much at the camera lens area, and we want to focus on getting rid of all the glass so then we can actually see the frame where the camera lens sits. Then what we want to do is break the glass pretty much at the top and at the left side. So then that way the piece of glass can either come out as one piece, or if it's broken into a bunch of pieces, it makes it a little bit easier. But either way, this glass is under the camera lens, so simply breaking that piece will not allow it to just fall out. Ultimately, what you want to do is remove that glass, clean up the adhesive around there, and then everything should look good. Then we can clean up our desk and start removing the excess glue that's on the actual frame. What I like to do is use a razor blade and remove all the adhesive around the edges, and I do this under a microscope so that I know it's perfect, or as perfect as I can get it. If you don't have a microscope, it's not really the biggest deal, but if you do have a microscope, I highly recommend using this option. So once everything looks clean and everything looks flat, what we're going to do is we're going to try on the back, make sure everything fits nicely, the sides feel nice, and everything seems to be good. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the B7000 glue. Again, this is going to be in the description below, and we're going to add glue pretty much all around the phone. So we're going to go around the trim of the phone, and then we're going to add some on the metal panel, pretty much what you see here. And then once the back looks like this, we're going to grab the back glass and we're going to apply it to the frame. And we're just going to make sure that the edges fit nicely. If you feel like doing it like I do, you don't have to, but you can put the front screen back onto the phone. That way it helps the clamps stay in a little bit easier, but sometimes it could be a little bit difficult. But what I like to do is add 5 or more clamps on the right side, 5 or more clamps on the left side, and then 2 or 3 clamps on the top and bottom. In this video, it was a little bit overkill, but I did want to make sure that the glass stays in place. Also, before you put the clamps on, make sure that the corners feel nice and everything feels flush or as close to stock as it can be. But either way, once you add all the clamps in the world like I did, what we're going to do is we're going to let this sit for about 2 to 3 hours. But if you can let this sit overnight, that's going to be even better. Once we're done letting that sit, we're going to remove all the clamps and put them over to the side. And then we can clean up the adhesive if we want, or we can focus on that a little bit later. But pretty much what you want to do is you can kind of just use your fingernail or maybe a plastic pick if you want to. You don't need anything metal or anything like that. This glue comes out fairly easily, so you don't really have to worry too much about that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to remove this screen again and carefully remove it. Make sure that if there is any glue that it doesn't attach to like the speaker or any cables like that, which it looks like it did. And then what we're going to do is remove any excess glue that you see, like kind of in the wireless charging area or near the charging port, stuff like that. Then we're going to remove this capped on tape and loosen up the microphone and the camera flash, as well as removing the piece that it sat on. And then we're going to set this back into place with this little piece that goes around it. Maybe a little bit difficult to install, but eventually you'll get it going. Then what we're going to do is put the cameras back in. If everything looks nice, then you're good. But feel free to add some compressed air to get rid of any dust that did get in there. So the first thing I like to do is add the wireless charging back in. So we're going to put this back in place, and we're going to add all these screws back in place and make sure everything looks nice. Then we can add this little cover over here. It may fall off or whatever, but it's not really the biggest deal. I just want to make sure it looks nice. Then we're going to add this antenna back in place, and we're going to put all these screws in. Again, make sure you know where the screws go, but the main thing you want to know is where these little metal pieces go and the directions that they do go. Feel free to pause and evaluate what I'm doing so then you can see exactly how it's supposed to go. But the main goal is to make sure that all these panels are going properly. This little piece that goes over the flex cable isn't really the biggest deal. It's just the ones that touch the top speaker and the screen matter. And now we can put the camera cover back on, as well as those screws that go into it. We can put this little antenna right here and then set the charging port in here as well. Remember that the antenna piece kind of goes over the charging port just on the top portion of the cable. Once you got everything lined up, what we're going to do is we're going to apply the 2 screws on the bottom. Make sure you put it in the right holes. And then we can start applying screws to the cable like the one on the left and the 3 screws on the right, all with the PH000 bit. Then we can use the standoff bit to put all the standoff screws back in place, as well as this little plastic piece. You can set the Taptic engine back in place, plug that in, and apply the 2 screws on the left side. Now we can put the speaker back in, starting with the bottom first, lining it up, and putting in those standoff screws, as well as the 1 Phillips screw on the bottom right. And while you're at it, you might as well plug in the speaker. Then we can put this antenna back on and put all the screws that go into place with the Y000 bit. And then we can set this little cover over the speaker right here and put in that screw that goes in there. Next, we can set the logic board back in, make sure to move all the cables out of the way, and make sure none of them get squished. It may be a little bit difficult to get the logic board back in place, but either way you can use a SIM card tray to kind of keep it in place. And as long as the SIM card goes in, you should be good, and make sure all the screws line up, and we can start putting in these PH000 screws, as well as this little metal piece that goes under this one screw on the top right. Now before we go too far, start plugging in stuff and making sure that everything looks nice, especially that charging port cable, which could be crooked, as well as plugging in those annoying cables and putting this little metal piece back on. And while we're at it, put in that standoff screw so that it doesn't flop around. Now we can plug in the top camera. Like I said, plug in all the cables, make sure everything lines up, and then we can put in the Face ID, and all it does is just slots in on the right, then you have to lift up on the left side, and it should just sit in place. Plug in the Face ID cables, and now we can put the battery in. So what I like to do is add some adhesive right here and right here, that way the battery stays in place. And that's pretty much all you need, you don't really need too much adhesive. Then the next thing you want to do is remove the adhesive around the edges and add some more adhesive, but one, my adhesive was pretty good, so I didn't really have to worry too much about that. And two, this phone isn't really that water resistant, and especially with having a broken back glass, it definitely is not water resistant anymore, so I'm not really worried too much about that. But you do want to make sure there is some adhesive to kind of hold down the screen so that it doesn't just flop off, because those two bottom screws are not enough to keep it in place. So we'll plug in the top flex cable, plug in the LCD and the digitizer, and then we're going to put the metal piece that goes over the digitizer area, as well as those three screws. Plug in the battery, and then put this little cover back over, as well as the four screws that go into that area, all using the Y000 bit. Now we can power it on, make sure it works fine, and it looks like it does. The camera looks fine too, and now we can push down on the screen, starting with the top, and then going down the right and the left side. And we grab the P2 driver and put in the bottom two screws. And that's it. Hopefully this video helped you out. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments section or message me on Twitter. And feel free to follow me on the social media listed above. Subscribe to my channel so you can see more videos like this, as well as some review videos. And hit that bell button so then YouTube reminds you when those videos do come out. Thanks for watching.